April 16th, 1945. The East China Sea is black beneath a moonless sky, its surface restless, breathing with a slow, heavy roll. On the horizon, Okinawa burns faintly like a dying city seen through smoke. Alone on radar picket station number 1, nearly 50 miles north of the invasion beaches, a single American destroyer cuts through the dark. USS Laffey. Her engines hum low beneath steel decks, already stained by weeks of war. Salt air clings to every railing. Exhaust smoke floats just above the waves. On the bridge, officers stare into emptiness, knowing the sky is no longer empty at all. Somewhere beyond the darkness, engines are already starting. Far out over the sea, young men in cockpits fasten helmets and write their names on scraps of cloth. Below deck, sailors check guns for the 100th time, lighting cigarettes with shaking hands. There have been whispers about this ship since her first battle. Unlucky, jinxed, a destroyer marked by something unseen. Tonight, she rides alone into the most dangerous airspace on Earth, and a name sailors once mocked is about to become a warning. By the spring of 1945, the Second World War had already torn continents apart. In Europe, the Third Reich was in visible collapse. Allied armies were pushing through Germany from every direction, Soviet artillery shook Berlin's outer streets, and Adolf Hitler's days were already numbered. But on the other side of the world, across oceans wider than imagination, the Pacific War had reached a far more desperate, brutal phase. Japan was losing, and it knew it. Its navy lay mostly on the ocean floor. Its air force had been shattered by years of attrition. Its cities burned under relentless B-29 bombing raids. Yet surrender was unthinkable. Instead, what remained of Japanese military doctrine hardened into something else entirely. Sacrifice as strategy, death as weapon. The war in the Pacific was no longer about naval dominance alone. It had become a war of will, of psychological endurance, of who could endure suffering longest without breaking. The American advance westward across the Pacific had been slow by design, methodical and merciless. Island by island, airstrip by airstrip, the United States Navy and Marine Corps had inched closer toward the Japanese homeland. Guadalcanal had been the first major test in 1942. Tarawa revealed the cost of assaulting heavily fortified beaches. Saipan in 1944 proved that Japan could no longer protect the skies over its inner defenses. Then came Leyte Gulf in October of that year, the largest naval battle in recorded history, where Japan's fleet was effectively annihilated as a fighting force. 4 Japanese aircraft carriers were sunk. Battleships and cruisers followed. It was a naval catastrophe that Japan would never recover from. The war at sea, in the conventional sense, was over. But that did not mean the war itself was over. Instead, Japan reinvented how it fought. With trained pilots dying faster than they could be replaced, with fuel shortages crippling flight training, and with replacement aircraft built hastily under bombing pressure, Imperial Japanese leadership looked for a weapon that did not depend on experience or return trips. They found it in the one resource still in abundance, young men willing, sometimes pressured, sometimes convinced, to die. The Tokatai, or Special Attack Units, became known to the world by a single word: Kamikaze, divine wind, a name borrowed from legend. A tactic born of despair. For American sailors, this changed everything. Traditional naval warfare followed rules. Aircraft attacked bombers where bombers flew, ships fought other ships, and combat mostly ended with sinking steel, not flesh. Kamikaze strikes broke all of that. These aircraft were not trying to hit ships. They were trying to become the weapon itself. They aimed not for holes, but for decks crowded with men. Explosives, fuel lines, and command centers. They didn't seek to disable. They sought to kill. From late 1944 onward, the U.S. Navy experienced something it had never trained for: waves of aircraft that did not care whether they survived the approach. Each engagement became a suicide pact, made one cockpit at a time. Then came Okinawa. In April 1945, the island became the great sacrificial battlefield of the Pacific. Just 350 miles from Japan's southernmost home island of Kyushu, Okinawa was the final stepping stone before invasion itself. Its airfields would become launch pads for constant bombardment. Its harbors would become staging zones for hundreds of ships. and its capture would put American forces within striking distance of the Japanese homeland. Both sides understood the stakes perfectly. For the United States, it meant the final approach. For Japan, it meant the beginning of annihilation. Japan responded with the largest kamikaze campaign of the war. Operation Tengo, which most associate with the death voyage of the battleship Yamato, was only the surface of something much broader. Beneath it churned Kikusui, floating chrysanthemum, a mass suicidal air offensive unlike anything seen before. Over the course of weeks, Japan would launch nearly 1,100 kamikaze sorties against Allied ships around Okinawa. Young pilots flew obsolete fighters, converted bombers, even float planes stripped of landing gear. Their orders were simple: reach the fleet, choose a ship, die into it. The Americans had prepared defenses, but preparation only went so far. The Pacific Fleet deployed a ring of radar picket destroyers around Okinawa, small, fast ships stationed far from the main fleet, acting as early warning sentinels. Their job was unforgiving: detect incoming aircraft, identify direction and altitude, call in fighters, hold off attackers for as long as possible. Delay the inevitable wave long enough for the carriers and transports behind them to prepare. The cost of those assignments was unspoken at first. Radar picket ships were isolated, exposed, and underarmed compared to the capital ships they protected. They became magnets for kamikaze attacks, lone silhouettes on open sea, blazing with radar transmissions like lighthouses at night. When Japanese pilots came in low and fast, these destroyers were often the first thing they saw. And when the pilots hit them, there was nowhere for the blast to go, except outward into flesh and steel both. By mid-April, thousands of sailors had already died off Okinawa. Entire decks had been erased in seconds. Crews were burned alive in turrets. Command bridges were turned into metal graveyards. Even heavily armored carriers suffered catastrophic fires from single impacts. A destroyer stood little chance by comparison. And yet, USS Laffey was sent anyway. On April 16th, she took up her position north of Okinawa, her crew fully aware they were being placed in the sky's crosshairs. The sea was calm that night. Too calm. Experience had taught them what that meant. Calm air made perfect hunting weather. Radar operators sat tensely before glowing scopes, waiting for blips that could mean death, moving at 300 miles per hour. Gunners cleaned barrels that were already clean. Officers walked decks without speaking. There would be no speeches, no announcements. Everyone aboard that ship knew exactly what radar picket duty meant, and as the horizon brightened toward dawn, USS Laffey stood alone on a line that existed only to bleed. The battle had not yet begun. USS Laffey was not meant to be legendary. When she was laid down in January 1943 at Bath Iron Works in Maine, she was one of hundreds, another gray hull in an assembly line of steel built to outpace disaster. She belonged to the Allen M. Sumner class of destroyers, a design born in urgency. These ships were faster than their predecessors, heavier in armament, broader in beam, designed to escort carriers, hunt submarines, and throw an iron curtain into the air against incoming planes. On paper, Laffey was modern, powerful, and properly armed for war. 5 5-inch dual-purpose guns, 12 40mm anti-aircraft cannons, 11 20mm Oerlikons, 10 torpedo tubes. Radar systems advanced for their time. She could throw more firepower per minute than many ships twice her size from just a few years earlier. She was not unlucky by design. She was meant to survive. But war does not care how a ship is meant to survive. Commissioned in February 1944, Laffey arrived late to a naval war already raging across half the planet. Her first assignments were escort duties, long, dull watches over Atlantic convoys vulnerable to German U-boats. Young sailors barely out of high school learned what monotony meant out on cold, rolling seas. Then, in the summer of 1944, she was sent into a battle that would shape her reputation forever. Normandy. On June 6th, USS Laffey crossed the English Channel and took her place off the beaches of France. D-Day was not just an amphibious landing. It was the largest concentrated naval artillery operation in history. Battleships pounded the coast. Cruisers shelled inland strongholds. Destroyers like Laffey rode close to shore, firing into bluffs so close they risked grounding. German artillery answered back. Mortar shells splashed like rain around her hull. Mines drifted beneath her bow. The ship survived the landings intact, but 2 days later, her luck ran out. On June 8th, while guarding the Normandy anchorage, a German bomber broke through Allied air cover and dove toward her. Anti-aircraft guns barked. Tracers stitched the sky. The plane released its bomb just before it slammed into the water. The explosion hurled a shrapnel storm across Laffy's decks. Flames erupted. Smoke swallowed her midsection. 75 sailors were wounded. Several were killed. She was forced to withdraw for repairs, one of many ships damaged during the invasion, but something about her survival felt incomplete. The ship remained afloat, but within her steel corridors, whispered conversations slowly began to change tone. Not fear, not exactly. Something colder, something quieter. Before she could fully recover, fate struck again. After being repaired, Laffy was transferred to the Mediterranean as part of the invasion of southern France. In August 1944, she again steamed toward hostile shores under enemy air threat, and again she was hit. This time by a glide bomb, a German-controlled weapon that piloted explosives toward ships remotely. The weapon exploded near her stern, damage spreading quickly. Fire raced through compartments. Men were thrown against bulkheads. Steel warped under heat. Once more, Laffy remained afloat. And once more, bodies lined makeshift medical stations. The ship had now endured 2 brutal survivals in less than 3 months. By autumn, sailors were beginning to murmur that something followed her. It wasn't superstition exactly. Navy men were practical. They trusted metal, maintenance, and orders. But war has a way of unhinging logic in quiet moments. When you survive what others do not, you begin to question why. Laffy was repaired yet again and returned to service, her hull bearing scars beneath fresh paint. Then came orders for reassignment. The Atlantic was quieting. The real war, the final war, was in the Pacific. Christmas of 1944 passed aboard transport ships bound west. The men aboard Laffy entered waters that seemed endless. Days bled into weeks, weeks into months. The Pacific was too big to feel possessed, and yet it swallowed ships just as completely. By early 1945, they reached Ulithi, a massive floating anchorage where hundreds of Allied ships rested before invasion. There, they heard stories, bad ones. Ships burned by kamikazes, crews trapped below deck, men fused into bulkheads by fire, destroyers snapping in half. A different kind of war waited further west. Japan was no longer fighting to win. Japan was fighting to wound. The mood aboard Laffy hardened as Okinawa approached. She was no longer a new ship. She had reputation now, and sailors do not forget reputations. Damaged in France, bombed twice, sent through hell, and brought back limping. Rumors traveled faster than any order. Some called her unlucky. Others said the opposite, that she could not be sunk. And a few whispered something stranger still, that she seemed to attract fire. No one wrote it down. No one said it aloud. But men stopped volunteering for certain stations. Some rubbed pieces of metal for luck. Others learned the sound of her hull so well they swore they could hear when trouble was near. Sailors noticed patterns when chaos becomes routine. And then came radar picket duty. Orders were handed down quietly. Laffy would take station number 1, one of the furthest posts from the invasion beaches, one of the most exposed, close to Japanese airfields, far from help. Her job was to stand watch alone beneath an enemy sky poisoned by death. There was no ceremony when she got underway. No final announcement, no speech from the captain. Just engines turning, just lines slipping free from steel cleats. Just a destroyer, already scarred by war, gliding east into a place few wanted to be and many did not leave. As dawn crept toward April 16, 1945, USS Laffy sailed into the most dangerous hours of her existence, and the sky began to change. The first angle of this story lives inside the ship, not on it, in narrow corridors thick with oil and sweat, where the sound of the ocean disappears beneath steel and machinery. For the men aboard USS Laffy, this was not a battle fought in heroic poses on open decks. It was fought crouched inside gun tubs, pressed against bulkheads, breathing smoke through soaked rags. Radar picket duty was not dramatic. It was waiting, waiting for blips, waiting for alarms, waiting for a sound that meant someone far away had already decided you would die. Sailors were 19, 20, 22 years old. Boys who had barely learned how to shave flipped switches that could summon fighter squadrons or mistakes. Firemen slept dressed, boots by their pillows. Medical corpsmen counted morphine syrettes before their hands were steady enough to carry them. Some wrote letters they did not mail. Some smoked continuously, knowing cigarettes might be their last luxury. Deep inside the hull, beneath waterline, engineers listened to turbines like doctors listen to hearts. Because if those engines failed, nothing else mattered. This ship did not feel like protection. It felt like confinement, like being sealed in a floating vault and told the sky itself was coming for you. The second angle is written in invisible light, in radar beams sweeping the heavens long before human eyes could see anything. Radar picket ships were not frontline warriors in the traditional sense. They were tripwires. USS Laffey existed on station not to survive the war, but to buy time for others to react. When her operators detected incoming aircraft, fighter controllers scrambled combat air patrols from carriers miles away. Every minute mattered. Every mile mattered. The destroyers' prints of light across dark skies were the first line of defense for thousands of men asleep aboard transports behind her. But there was cruel irony at work here. Radar did not cloak a ship. It marked it. Every signal reaching into the sky also announced something else. Here I am. Japanese receivers picked up those transmissions, followed them like hunters tracking heartbeats. Radar made Laffey visible across miles of empty air. Her job was to see first, and be seen first. The third angle lies in steel thickness, weld quality, and design philosophy. The science behind survival when the math says survival should not exist. The Allen M. Sumner-class destroyers were not battleships. Their armor was thin, their margins were narrow, but they were built with reality in mind. Redundancy was everything. Double fire mains, emergency pumps, partition compartments, manual controls in case electricity failed. Every system aboard Laffey had a shadow system waiting behind it. Damage control was not secondary. It was doctrine. Sailors trained endlessly to fight fires, plug hull breaches, and reroute power in near darkness. What saved ships like Laffey was rarely just armor. It was preparation. It was men who knew how to stop water with mattresses and wood, who knew how to handle hoses while burning alive, who could seal doors they might never open again. Ships did not survive kamikazes because they were strong. They survived because men refused to let them die. And as the early morning light crept across the sea, all three angles, human, tactical, mechanical, began to tilt toward the same point in the sky. Something was coming. From the other side of the sky, from airfields etched into the hills of southern Kyushu, a different story was unfolding, one that did not allow its pilots to imagine survival at all. The young men climbing into cockpits on the morning of April 16th wore uniforms as carefully pressed as if for ceremony. Many had barely completed flight training. Others had only practiced how to take off, not how to land. Their planes were loaded beyond safe limits, fuel tanks bursting full, bomb racks replaced with explosives fused directly to their frames. Some carried photographs tucked inside jackets. Some wrapped white headbands around their foreheads. Embroidered with rising suns and mottos of honor, none were told what ship they would die for. None would ever know if their sacrifice helped or vanished unnoticed into the sea. For many, this was not fanaticism. It was obedience sharpened by inevitability. They had been taught that their deaths could balance a crumbling empire, that steel could not withstand spirit, that a navy of ghosts might succeed where fleets had failed. The truth, that a destroyer alone could absorb their lives without changing the war's direction, waited silently beyond the clouds. There was also a moral angle, one that lived uncomfortably between both sides. American sailors did not cheer when kamikaze planes burned. They sometimes went quiet. They watched pilots go down in flames, knowing full well what drove them. They understood in a distant, complicated way, not approval, but recognition. The knowledge that human beings had turned themselves into weapons did not feel like victory. It felt like the world breaking apart. For the Japanese air crews, death was framed as purpose. For the Americans, life was reduced to reflex. Everyone was trapped inside a system that rewarded destruction. The ocean beneath USS Laffey would soon carry not just wreckage, but bodies from both nations, indistinguishable once they sank. And then there is the command angle, the quiet terror of leadership, when every decision may be someone else's last. A destroyer captain lived under a burden that could not be shared. When radar screens bloomed with incoming contacts, it was his voice that filled the ship's speakers, his orders that directed guns, his decisions that placed men left, right, high, or below. USS Laffey's officers were not shouting heroes. They were calculators under fire, choosing which threat to engage first when all threats were fatal, knowing when to maneuver and when to hold course, knowing that a hard turn could save a bridge and doom an engine room, or vice versa. Leadership aboard a radar picket was not about glory. It was about choosing who lived when not everyone could. Inside the Combat Information Center, red lights glowing like wounded eyes, calls began to filter through radios. Unknown aircraft massing, multiple contacts inbound, bearing changes every minute. The air defense network was screaming into life. Fighters were launched from distant decks, voices overlapping, clipped, urgent. The sky itself no longer belonged to the sky. And then came the tone, not a sound exactly, a feeling. A tension pulsing through the hull like a premonition. Sailors drifted to battle stations faster than orders demanded. Helmets snapped into place. Belts tightened without being told. Gun crews loaded shells as though muscle memory had been waiting months to finally speak. On radar screens, faint blips surged closer, and closer, and closer. And then USS Laffey saw what no radar could explain. Black dots against a pale sky, falling toward her with intention. The war had finally reached her deck. April 16th, 1945. Just after 8:08 a.m., the first Japanese aircraft broke through the cloud layer, low and fast, its engine screaming across open water. Within seconds, USS Laffey erupted into motion. General quarters sounded. The ship locked itself into combat rhythm. 5-inch guns tilted skyward. 40-millimeter barrels swung in unison. Tracer fire stitched pale blue arcs into the morning light. Smoke spilled from gun mounts as shells detonated in invisible collisions above the waves. The first Kamikaze clipped a wing under fire and disintegrated in midair, its flames scattering like a meteor over the sea. There was no time to process it. More were coming. Many more. Within minutes, the sky above radar picket station number 1 became a funnel of death. Aircraft approached from multiple directions at once, zigzagging between flak bursts and plunging through fire as if immune to fear. Some exploded before reaching the ship. Others did not. The second plane struck Laffey's port side near the forward gun mount, its explosion tearing metal flesh open in a single violent breath. Fire sprang outward, filling passageways with smoke and screaming. Men were flung from their feet. A turret was silenced instantly. Blood smeared steel like paint. The third aircraft came even lower, so low that gunners could see the pilot's goggles. It clipped the mast and detonated above the bridge, its blast hammering the command center and ripping antennas into the sea. Shrapnel poured through compartments. Radios fell silent one by one. The ship remained blind even as more enemies descended. Flames licked toward ammunition lockers. Damage control teams flooded corridors with foam and seawater. The smell of fuel blended into the smell of burning flesh. A fourth plane exploded off the starboard bow, its impact shaking the hull like a collision with land. A fifth plunged into the sea so close that water blasted on board like a wave explosion, drenching burning men with boiling spray. Every false hit still wounded. Every impact, even those that missed, was a weapon. Then came the sixth. It tore straight through the aftergun mount and disappeared inside the ship before detonating. The explosion hollowed bulkheads. The deck buckled. Men vanished in fire where they had stood seconds earlier. An internal firestorm surged through ventilation systems like a living thing. In the engine room, temperature alarms screamed. In medical compartments, corpsmen tore bandages from walls and pressed them against faces melted into anonymity. The bridge was hit again. This time, it did not care who was standing there. Commanding Officer Lieutenant Commander Frederick J. Beckton was thrown from his feet. blood blinding one eye. His executive officer collapsed beside him, wounded. Communications were dead. Steering control flickered as systems failed across the ship. But somehow, the helm still answered. Somehow, engines still turned. Laffey was now burning from bow to stern, and the attack did not pause. Planes came through smoke like ghosts, invisible until too close. Men fired until barrels glowed dull red. Shell casings rolled across decks slick with blood and fire retardant. Hands blistered. Eardrums ruptured. Voices disappeared into chaos. Somewhere forward, an ammunition hoist was jammed manually by sailors who did not stop as flames climbed their clothes. A seventh aircraft dived. It struck the water just off the port side and exploded outward instead of inward. The shockwave battered the hull, ripping railings away and shattering windows across every deck forward of the bridge. The blast rolled through passageways like thunder through tunnels. An eighth followed. It came in low on the starboard quarter, exploding in fire and debris that tore into the superstructure. Waves of heat ignited fuel lines. Deck guns were scorched useless. The ship's silhouette glowed like a furnace against the blue sea. Human beings do not imagine moments like these. They endure them. Somewhere below deck, flooding indicators blinked red across compartments that no longer existed. Damage control officers redirected teams again and again into smoke that swallowed men alive. Every decision was made in seconds that felt like lifetimes. Every order could mean survival, or death 5 steps later. Still, USS Laffey did not stop firing. Her crew worked as though the ship were indestructible, as though steel answered to will alone. But in the black sky above her, death was not finished writing. The 9th Kamikaze came through smoke and flame like it had risen out of hell itself. It dropped steeply out of the sun, screaming through curtain fire, and slammed directly into the deck house. The impact obliterated what remained of the superstructure. The blast blew sailors clear off the ship and scattered bodies into the sea like debris. On the bridge, men were cut down where they stood. Compartments turned into incinerators in seconds. Fire raced along cable runs as though following a map inside the ship's bones. For a moment, USS Laffey vanished behind her own smoke. She did not disappear in silence. A 10th aircraft followed almost immediately, crashing into the base of the afterstack. The explosion buckled steel inward like paper. Flames surged through the engineering spaces. Power failed across multiple systems simultaneously. Pumps went dead. Smoke filled every level. Some sailors held their breath underwater, flooding compartments above their heads, waiting for either air or death to arrive first. The 11th did not strike the ship directly. It exploded just yards away, and it was worse. The blast wave imploded bulkheads and ignited fuel vapor suspended in air. The fireball consumed men standing 30 feet away from any flame source. It cooked skin through fabric, melted boots to deck. The shock traveled like a hammer through the keel, rattling teeth and snapping light fixtures loose in darkened corridors. By now, Laffey was no longer a ship in the traditional sense. She was a burning structure still afloat. Only her guns continued behaving like a ship, manned by men who were not. The 12th aircraft came last. Low, steady, unhurried. It angled in from port and pulled level just long enough for gunners to swing their barrels. Tracers caught it in the engine. Flames burst outward, but momentum carried the plane forward still. It clipped the ship and skidded into the sea before detonating. The explosion tore water and fire skyward in a towering white column that rained steel and flesh back down on the deck. Then, nothing. No engines, no diving silhouettes, no scream in the heavens anymore. Just sirens wailing inside a crippled destroyer and the unnatural quiet of an exhausted sky. Men stood in fire with hoses dropped at their feet. Others leaned against walls stripped bare by heat. One compartment was nothing but glowing metal and silence. Entire gun crews no longer existed. Medics worked inside smoke that refused to lift. They prioritized by movement, not sound, because the wounded who did not move often did not breathe. Lieutenant Commander Becton, wounded and half-blinded, remained on the bridge. His uniform was soaked with blood that was not entirely his own. He gave orders in a voice that scraped itself raw. He asked the same question over and over. "Are we still afloat?" And every time, someone answered yes. But the ship was lying now. Her list to port was visible even to those barely able to stand. Fires still blazed below deck. Fuel burned blue across black water, trailing behind her like a wound stretching into the sea. Ammunition cooking off popped in distant compartments like muffled gunfire. The possibility of sinking, delayed, denied, but alive, followed every footstep. The crew waited for the sea to decide. Water lapped closer to doorways that had once been dry. Men stood staring into nothing. Some whispered prayers, some whispered names, some said nothing at all, because they had already emptied themselves of sound. Then slowly, impossibly, the list stabilized. The bow did not drop. The ship did not break. The ocean did not take her. USS Laffey remained afloat. And in that stillness, no one cheered. They only waited to see if staying alive would last longer than the smoke. When the sea finally stopped trying to claim USS Laffey, it left her as something unrecognizable, a hunched, blackened silhouette leaking fire and fuel, drifting with engines barely alive. Dawn had passed during the attack, but the morning sun revealed nothing that felt like daylight. Smoke clung stubbornly to her superstructure, wrapping what remained of the bridge in a gray shroud. The decks were cratered and warped. The paint burned away in long, blistered streaks where flame had poured across steel. Railings lay twisted. Antennas hung like snapped bones. Guns stood frozen in their last firing positions, their barrels scorched a dull charcoal gray. Inside the ship, the scene was worse. Passageways were filled with debris, blood, and running water. Fire hoses snaked across the floor like exhausted serpents. Electrical cables dripped melted insulation. Doors had been welded shut by heat, trapping the dead behind them. Men moved through smoke and silence, carrying bodies out of compartments that no longer smelled like life. The wounded were lined along any surface that would hold them, tables, decks, bulkheads, marked only by the severity of their injuries, not by name. Official casualty counts would come later. In the moment, there were only faces. 75 sailors had been killed, dozens more wounded, many burned, some blinded, others shredded by shrapnel. Entire gun crews ceased to exist in seconds. Medics ran out of supplies long before they ran out of victims. Some injured men were beyond help from the beginning. Others slipped away hours later, silent beneath blood-soaked blankets, long after the last plane had vanished from the sky. Yet the ship had not sunk. In the Pacific, that fact alone mattered. Support vessels eventually arrived, weaving through the haze like ghosts. Tugs came first, then medical crews. Survivors were evacuated in small groups, stretched thin across makeshift triage stations on nearby ships. Laffey's remaining crew stayed behind to keep her alive, fight fires that refused to die, drain compartments that insisted on filling, brace bulkheads that seemed ready to collapse under the weight of damage and memory. Fleet Command could hardly believe the reports when they filtered through channels that had been cut and rerouted again and again. A destroyer had absorbed 12 kamikaze impacts and near misses, and floated. Damage assessments read like fiction. Structural estimates contradicted photos because they assumed no vessel of her class should exist after that much punishment. Engineers boarded wearing expressions closer to disbelief than professionalism. A destroyer's hull was not supposed to survive even 2 such strikes, and yet she had endured 12. Word spread across the Pacific Fleet within days. Sailors spoke her name in hushed tones on mess decks and in engine rooms. The ship others once joked about being unlucky had crossed into something else entirely. Now she was spoken of as guarded, watched, dangerous to attack, impossible to kill, not because of superstition, but because men had seen evidence. For Captain Becton, there would be no celebration. He walked through burned corridors, speaking quietly to wounded men and to nothing where others once stood. He wrote letters that would change families forever. He memorized names and numbers that would follow him long after the war. He stood in front of twisted steel once curated into weapons and gave no speech. There is nothing to say after 12 impacts, only to survive and not understand how. USS Laffey was no longer combat capable, but she was alive. And the war, beyond the smoke, was still burning. USS Laffey did not return to war. She could not. Her structure was compromised. Her guns were scorched. Her systems were stitched together with improvisation and exhaustion. Tugs pulled her slowly away from Okinawa, not with ceremony, but with the quiet care reserved for something fragile and irretrievable. The sea that had failed to kill her now carried her gently, as if reluctant to touch her again. She was towed first to Ulithi, the great artificial harbor of ships where silence was always temporary and grief always crowded the waterline. There, floating dry docks received her like an injured animal. Workers moved slowly along her hull, patching wounds that would never fully close. Hull plates were replaced, electrical lines rethreaded, compartments disinfected of smoke and death. Yet some spaces were left sealed forever, some sections were not repaired. They were buried. Even new paint could not hide everything. Her scars remained, so did her story. In official Navy records, her survival was noted formally, without adjectives. Actions were listed, dates were logged, casualty numbers recorded, but among the men of the Pacific Fleet, paperwork did not carry her weight. Sailors talked about her the way infantry talk about impossible hills, or pilots talk about haunted skies. Lafay became proof that odds could be insulted, that design could resist destiny, that courage might matter even when it should not. Lieutenant Commander Becton received the Navy Cross, so did others. Medals arrived in small boxes months later. They were pinned onto chests that still flinched at loud sounds. They were mailed to mothers who would never touch the sons they honored. Official language thanked crews for their extraordinary heroism. The men themselves rarely used the word hero. They said tired, they said burned, they said lucky, if they said anything at all. In August 1945, the war ended. Atomic fire erased Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan surrendered. The oceans finally fell silent. And USS Lafay, battered but unbeaten, had outlived the war itself. She went on to serve in the Korean War years later, as if refusing to become history, even when history tried to claim her. Eventually, she came home. Today, USS Lafay rests in Charleston, South Carolina, a museum ship with her deck stilled and her guns sacredly quiet. Tourists walk her corridors without smoke in their lungs. Children climb her ladders without fear in their hearts. Flags move freely above a ship that once burned under a sky that wanted her gone. The sailors who survived grew older. Many are gone now. But the steel remembers, and she is still there, still afloat, still bearing 12 invisible scars in her bones, still refusing to be only a story. Because some ships do not sink. They endure, and in that endurance they become something else entirely. Wars are often measured in maps, in territory gained or lost, in flags raised and lowered. But the truth of war lives elsewhere, in places that do not show up on charts. It lives in steel corridors thick with smoke, in hands blistered around rifles and fire hoses, in silence after a scream. USS Lafay did not change the outcome of the Battle of Okinawa. She did not end the war. Her survival did not rewrite strategy or shift alliances. And yet, history keeps returning to her again and again because her story carries something deeper than victory. She reminds us what human beings endure when ordered into impossible positions. Radar picket ships were built to die first, to warn others, to draw danger away from fleets that would never know their names. The men aboard Lafay were not spared by design. They were spared by action, by discipline, by instinct, by men refusing to abandon a ship when it would have been easier to abandon hope. When people once called her cursed, they were not sensing doom. They were sensing familiarity with fire. Some machines attract destruction. Some attract memory. USS Lafay became both. She became an argument against inevitability, a contradiction to probability, a floating monument not to war, but to survival inside it, shared, brutal, unromantic survival that asks nothing from history but to be remembered honestly. And today, she does not rest beneath the waves like so many others. She waits in the open, so that when people step onto her decks, they do not step into legend. They step into truth, a truth written not in ink, but in burn marks still etched into steel. A truth that whispers quietly through empty gun mounts and rusted ladders. Some ships carry war across oceans, and some carry it forever, still afloat, still here, still remembering.